I'm Robert LeBoyer, Senior Biotechnology Analyst at Noble Capital. Our next presenting company is SeaStar Medical, a company developing new therapeutics and solutions for a dysregulated immune response. With us today is CEO Eric Schlorft, who will give the presentation. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for the invitation here to present here at the Noble group. So it's a real true honor to share this presentation with you. Obviously, we're a publicly traded company. These are forward-looking statements. So let's start with what is and who is SeaStar Medical. We are a company that's really focused on inflammation, and more specifically, the dysregulated immune response that happens when there's an overproduction of inflammatory cells. These are obviously catastrophic for many indications in the intensive care unit as well as in the chronic setting. But what we've been able to show is that through use of our selective cytophoretic device or cell-directed extracorporeal therapy, we can bring activated cells or immune cells back into a reparative and homeostatic state. We are essentially quelling the immune system, which is then taking it back into that reparative state. You can see here the brand name for the pediatric is called Quelimmune. These look and feel like a device. You would actually have them in your hand. They feel like it, but they are far from doing that from a pharmaceutical or pharmacology perspective. What they are actually doing is autologous cell therapy. That is why we're actually overseen by the biologics division of the FDA as a device. I am so happy to announce that we have received first FDA approval in children, which I'll talk about, which was in February of 2024. Now, we are starting in the kidneys, much of the focus of this presentation today, but every one of these organs, the liver, the lungs, the heart, as well as the brain, many have dysregulated immune responses or systems where neutrophils, which I'll talk about, and monocytes are out of balance. So, what is it that we bring? It's a proprietary platform. We now have an approved product in children. We're running a clinical study to support a pre-market authorization or PMA for adults. We continue to generate economic data on it. We have lots of applications in both acute and chronic. And then on top of it, we have a world-class team that's really executing on the business strategy. So let me start with the first, which is the FDA approval of a HDE or Humanitarian Device Exemption. This was an approval order that we received, which means we have now the ability to go out and commercialize. This is for pediatric patients. These are 10 kilograms or 22 pounds and above. They have acute kidney injury. They're in the ICU. They are also on continuous renal replacement therapy. Now, what makes this so important as well is that these are patients with sepsis or a septic condition. There are not a lot of drugs or devices out there that have that on their label. Again, this is under 8,000 patients, which we'll talk a little bit when we get into market size or TAMs. So the cytokine storm really can be driven by many different what we call insults or injuries. This can be a bacterial infection, viral, trauma, surgery. All of these things can lead to end organ damage and failure and even permanent organ damage or death. So when we think about what starts it, the selective cytophoretic device doesn't actually concern ourselves with how it actually gets started. It's about how we address the immune system. If you look on the left, what is a traditional response of the body is that the first responders are neutrophils and monocytes. These neutrophils and monocytes are going to the site of the injury, and then they are excreting things we call cytokines or messengers that kind of rally the troops that there's a source of infection and we need to take care of it and fix it. What happens is the immune system gets out of balance. And the next thing you know, we have what they call a dysregulated immune response, hyperinflammation, or the cytokine storm. Many of the pharmaceutical companies and biologic companies are trying to go after each one of these little dots on the actual tornado diagram here on the left. Those can have some challenges because it's really not controlling the source of the actual cytokine storm. Here on the right, we'll talk a little bit more in detail, but the selective cytophoretic device really is able to selectively take out the activated neutrophils and then reprogram them and bring them back into the body in a deactivated state. And you can see that really then quells the immune system all the way to improve clinical outcomes, which we'll get to. But let's first start with, where does this actually occur and what is it? Well, you can see here that in the intensive care unit, this is a normal continuous renal replacement therapy, or many call it dialysis if it's short, continuous if it's CRRT. It usually comes out of this thing, a hemofilter, and then goes back into the blood. This is the SCD on here on the right. It takes about 15 minutes for trained hospital staff to change this out on a daily basis. What we are essentially doing is creating a microenvironment. And so in a low calcium environment, whole blood is coming in, it's selectively taking out the most highly activated immune cells. They stick inside the fibers. They're in a low calcium environment, they are driven into cell death, and then they dissociate, go back into the body, and signal that the cytokine storm needs to be over and the reparative process needs to go. Very simple, but a very elegant solution. So before I get into some clinical data, let's first start with how sick have the patients actually been that have been treated with the selective cytopheretic device? Well, the first is on average, they have 3 organs that have failed. These are usually always the kidneys, which is our first indication. They also have usually either their lungs, heart, or the other 2 kind of common organ failures. You also see this 50 to 60% of these patients are septic. These are very, very sick patients. So when we think about the clinical data I'm going to share with you, it is all based on underlying averages of using these patient criteria. So what you see here in 5 different studies in non-COVID AKI studies, everything from a 10-kilogram child all the way to 80 plus years old, we have seen the same consistent results across 5 different studies. You can see here in each one of these cases, we reduce the mortality rate. We essentially cut it in half. These are patients that are literally have a coin flip, whether they are going to live or die. And then if they are fortunate enough to actually survive, about a quarter of those patients are normally on long-term dialysis or dialysis dependency at day 60. What is incredible about our data that we have shown consistently is that no patient is on dialysis at day 60. That, in our mind, is where the real game changer is, because this lowers the probability, possibly eliminates the possibility of these patients going on any sort of long-term dialysis, which we'll get into the economic impact of that. So you can't talk about efficacy or probable benefit without talking about safety. What you see here in almost 20,000 hours of exposure of the SCD, we have no device-related serious adverse events, and we have no device-related infections. I say that because when people think about, when you play around with the immune system and you're taking maybe a down like a steroid or immunosuppressing, that can cause infections. We don't see any of those types of things that are related to the device at all. So we're now in the process. We have FDA approval in Humanitarian Device for Children. We're launching with Nuwellis is our distribution partner for that in the United States. We also have Fresenius Medical is our contract manufacturer. This is going to be a very targeted approach to children's hospitals. There are only about 220 children's hospitals, and you can imagine that the 80-20 rule really does apply here, where 80% of the volume is probably in about 20% of those hospitals. So what is the value proposition? Well, when a patient has severe AKI, they have a 28 times more likelihood to develop chronic kidney disease and 8 more times to develop end-stage renal disease. So obviously these have very poor prognosis on these patients. And we all do know that the cost of treating a single patient a year for dialysis is about $100,000 a year. And that is not just one time. That is every year that that patient is on chronic dialysis. Now, the way that we're approaching the pricing of this is that we would like to be able to disrupt the market in the sense of actually driving out healthcare costs, but really driving some of the adoption here of the use of the SCD. You can see here the total cost is around $10,000 to $20,000, and that's for 3 to 7 days. This is a disposable model, so the way to kind of think about it, it's about $3,500 a day is what it will cost the hospital systems today. So while we focus on the 4,000 US patients that are on the pediatric side initially, you can see that the adult market is much larger potential, about 50 times larger. So what we are in the process of doing as we speak is what we call neutralize AKI study. And this is a randomized controlled study. You can see it's a 1-to-1, it's up to 200 patients. The standard of care today is continuous renal replacement therapy using regional citrate anticoagulation. And I would like to point out a few things. So the endpoints, we are going after the endpoints of all-cause mortality or dialysis dependency. So these are it's very black and white. Is the patient alive or is the patient dead? Is the patient on dialysis or are they not at day 90? That is really important. Day 90 is actually considered, if you are on dialysis at day 90, you have chronic kidney disease or CKD, which is why we've aligned it to that. We are also doing a secondary endpoint out to 1 year. Why is that? Well, we were going to show that it is a durable therapy, that you really are getting this one time in the ICU, and you're not having to come back for that same acute kidney injury incident that occurred where the kidneys had failed and you had to go on CKRT. So we look at this as a fix it the first time and fix it right. So yesterday we had announced that we now have 6 clinical trials activated, 24 sites in the study. Again, the target here is 1 patient per site per month. We are progressing on track. The interim analysis is expected at 100 patients, which should occur sometime here in the second half of 2024. And while it's easy to say, well, AKI or acute kidney injury is a great market to start with, we also actually have a different way of looking at this whole entire market. And the way we look at it is really it's inflammation. It's not so much organ specific, it's really organ agnostic. And so we're using medical affairs to really help in medical education to drive the message, the approach, starting to get the various organizations and institutions and physicians to start thinking about addressing inflammation in a very novel way that can potentially change the way that they do medicine in the future. So we have this robust pipeline that you see here. The first, obviously, is the pediatric AKI that is approved. The next one's all in the adults. I want to make sure the audience understands. This is all using the same device. So the same SCD is used in every one of these indications. So it's a highly leveraged play in the sense that for adult AKI, which is a breakthrough, is the same underlying technology and also SCD that's used in cardiorenal syndrome, which with a bridge to LVAD, or hepatorenal. All 3 of those have been approved as awarded the breakthrough device designation from the FDA. And we're teamed up and working closely with the University of Michigan to really refine those patient populations, just to really outline where the SCD may be effective in the future. We have an experienced management team. We just recently brought on David Green. David joined us in January, beginning of January, and by the end of that month in January, we'd actually closed on a $9 million round. Kevin Chung is a retired colonel in the Army, critical care doc, and he considers himself an extracorporeal enthusiast. Tom Mullen, deep experience in wide functions, but manufacturing and product development is where he has been focused. And then Dr. Cy Iyer comes from a pharmaceutical background in medical affairs. So we're taking a very different approach to medical affairs. these are some of the key potential value driving milestones. So you see that FDA approval in 2004 is a check. We're in the process of that commercial launch, which we initiated in Q1 of 2024. And then you can see the timing for the adult pivotal study, which really the next big inflection point will be around the second half of this year, where we'll have that interim analysis that will really be in the form of a recommendation from the DSMB, or Data Safety Monitoring Board. So just, in summary, I hope that the audience really clearly understands that this is a proprietary technology that addresses things that are just, there's no clinical unmet need, and unfortunately, they're very life-threatening. We have an approved product in children. We're advancing very nicely on the pivotal study, Neutralize AKI. We continue to generate economic data, and the technology, quite frankly, has so many applications, but we as a company must be focused, which is really where that's what our job is to do as we execute on our business strategy. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Eric. That was very interesting. And some of the points you made and the clinical endpoints about survival and dialysis independence are very critical, not only for the patient and the long-term outcome, but also the cost savings that you mentioned. The value
Yes.
of this is tremendous. So one of the questions that comes up is, what was the level of interest from the physicians and hospitals in adopting Quelimmune?
Well, yeah, so we are just in the process right now of launching into about 5 sites. So these are clinical sites where we've worked with them on the pediatric side to get them through the process. So it goes through an institutional review boards, or IRBs, hospital systems, but clearly there's a hunger for something that can help change the way that they do medicine. The standard of care is not acceptable.
Well, yeah, the field is wide open. There's essentially little to nothing. So yeah, you have a solution that, the need is unquestioned. So how important is the sepsis portion of the label, and how do doctors respond to that?
Well, Robert, that's a great question. So the sepsis portion of that label is absolutely outstanding. I don't know any other way to put it, because as you know, there is nothing out there in the market for sepsis. And for us to be able to get that on the label as one of the patient criterias really then speaks to the underlying data that the FDA had saw during our review process of why they would even put that on the label. Because obviously that's not something that is just thrown around. Sepsis, as you know, is a massive problem. It's 1.8 million patients. The amount of, it's in the billions of dollars in a year that are spent on trying to treat it. And unfortunately, the heterogeneity of sepsis is causes a lot of problems for people to address it. We've been able to show that we can kind of wean through that heterogeneity because we're insult agnostic, and we don't really worry about how it starts.
Yes, and yeah, I have seen many companies attempt drugs for sepsis, and the failure has been almost universal. So seeing that is really a breakthrough.
Yes.
And in terms of the FDA approval, why did you go for children, for the pediatric market first before adults, which has so many more patients? And does one affect the regulatory process for the other, or some benefit by doing it that way?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. I don't know if I could just kind of say, the FDA actually funded the pediatric study. So it was one of the orphan grants that actually funded it. So that's actually how we got into pediatrics. And we saw that the same data from some of the early adult studies was very much translatable in that. And so obviously, when you're a small company and the FDA also funds a clinical study for you, that shows a pretty powerful message that there's something there. We then, through HDE, I wouldn't say it's any easier with an HD, you have to show that that's safe and it probable benefit. So we don't have to show statistically significance. But what this really does, Robert, is this allows us to get into the market now, right? With a small, while it's even a small market, it actually has huge impacts long term. So we can not only learn exactly what, as we're introducing this into the pediatric hospitals, many of those key learnings are actually going to be used when we're launching, in the future potential adult indications. So, it's always great to be able to kind of learn as you go. And this is just one of those great opportunities to be able to do that.
Sure. Okay. And in terms of meeting the patient enrollment criteria and the goals that you set, is this something that is possible or very firm? And are these milestones things that we can really look forward to, or kind of loose time frame?
Well, you should definitely look forward to them, but I'm gonna mince your words a little bit. Look, with clinical studies, it's always difficult to really truly predict how enrollment is. We have to look at the past and history. I feel like we have a really good chance to be able to hit the second half interim and then quickly close the study out in the beginning of that first half of that 2025. I have the total confidence in our team to be able to do that as we build these relationships with these hospitals. And we're seeing that there's patients out there that are being enrolled in the study. So it is it's not that you're trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Sure. Okay. Great. And in terms of potential market sizes for additional indications, how much could you give some kind of estimates as to the number of patients or what you can expect for additional indications?
Yeah, so one of the slides, I think when we went through the pipeline, you can kind of get a sense there of examples would be like hepatorenal. So this is where the liver and the kidneys have failed, where mortality rates are literally like 80 to 100%. There you might want to look at 200 to 500,000 kind of target where, because there are differences between NASH and cirrhotic, and there are some differences. I don't know if we haven't done enough to really see what the difference is on therapeutically to basically claim, one or the other. But at the end of the day, you also have cardiac. There's a ton. Again, I always see these in like chunks of the same like AKI that we have 200,000 here, 200,000 there. We look for indications where I always love to say we can drive a Mack truck through kind of the clinical results or the clinical need that's out there, because mortality rates are so high that there's just nothing out there where you really don't have to have large clinical studies to show a statistical difference.
Yeah. There's so little available and the need is so great. So yes, I would agree with you on that. And are you planning to publish some of the study data in peer-reviewed journals?
Yeah, it will. Once we have the study complete, we will definitely be publishing that data. But look, we published about, I think, 5 or 6 peer-reviewed publications just this last year. So we continue to build out the story, and we're going to use it obviously as medical education and medical affairs is one of our key drivers. So educating physicians on how this is actually used and the utility in so many different indications will start to really broaden that. And having it peer reviewed is obviously the gold standard.
Okay, good. And in terms of financials, what can we expect in terms of revenues for the coming quarters, cash runway, and you mentioned some funding from the FDA, any additional non-dilutive funding from grants or government contracts, and anything related to the stock or anything like that?
Okay, I'll tackle the ones that I can. So we closed on $9 million back in January, late January. And so, we haven't really given guidance yet on kind of burn rates, et cetera. But if you look at it's probably in $1.5 million a month, somewhere in that time. We're running a clinical study. We are very judicious about bringing lots of people on. So we're still a very lean, mean fighting machine. And then, we obviously, we constantly will apply for grants, non-dilutive funding. There's just no way to predict if any of those things will ever happen or when they will happen or timing. Look, I would say that also, as we work with our partner Nuelis, we haven't neither party has given really guidance on what we see it from a revenue standpoint yet. But, as we start to get some visibility on that, I can see that would be kind of one of our next steps is to at least provide a little bit more insight there to our investors.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. This is very interesting technology, clear unmet need. So I'll be looking forward to watching those milestones and following your progress.
Thank you so much,
for joining
Robert.
us.
Thank you.